This is Poetry Lesson 3, Part 1, in which we'll take a closer look at diction and imagery. A question to keep in mind as we go is what's so interesting about poetry? Why does poetry stand out as a literary genre? Listen to this brief poem by Emily Dickinson. A word is dead when it is said, some say. I say it just begins to live that day. What do you think this means? Before we answer that, perhaps we should talk a little bit about diction. The word diction means word choice, just like a dictionary has many words to choose from. The words a poet chooses to use in a poem have a greater consequence than the words an author uses in a prose paragraph. Why? Because a poet uses fewer words, so a poet must choose words carefully, and the words must be packed with meaning because there are no words to spare. Each word is consequential, which means important or significant. What are the consequences of word choices? The answer to that question has to do with denotation and connotation. Denotation is the literal definition of a word. For example, the denotation of the American flag is a rectangular image with a specific design of red, white, and blue stars and stripes. Connotation, on the other hand, is an inferred meaning of a word based on previous experiences. For some people, the connotation of the American flag is freedom, national pride, strength, and opportunity. For other people, the American flag might connotate abuse of power, overindulgence, or even hate. There is no debate about the denotation of the flag, but the connotation depends on the experiences of the person viewing the flag. Connotation is always a matter of personal interpretation. Word choices have consequences all the time, not just in poetry. Let's say you're at the movies and your friend is running a bit late. If a stranger tries to sit in the seat beside you, you might say, "Sorry, I was saving that seat." The response you might get could be, "Oh, sure, whatever," as the stranger moves away. The connotation is just as it sounds. "No problem. I'll just sit somewhere else." Another response you might get is, "Oh, sure, whatever." The underlying message here is very different. This stranger is communicating an implied message, and it's a rude one at that. Even though this stranger is using the exact same words as the previous stranger, you can infer that this one is pretty unhappy with you. The way we communicate our words can be just as consequential as the diction itself. Try this little connotation test. Who is most like you? Avery, who sits in a chair, Jordan, who sits on the couch, Taylor, who sits on the carpet, or Morgan, who sits on the grass? Your answer will most likely depend on the connotations of the words chair, couch, carpet, and grass. What do you think these words mean to you? What do they make you think about? What can you infer about Avery, Jordan, Taylor, and Morgan based on their seating preferences? Your answer may also be affected by the names Avery, Jordan, Taylor, and Morgan. They're all gender neutral names, but you might have personal experiences that cause you to react differently to one name or another. Words have consequences when they're communicated, so poets must be particularly careful with their diction. Take a look at this picture and write a poem about it. Don't panic, just a one-word poem, but if your poem has only one word in it, you must choose that one word very carefully so that you express as much as possible with that one word. Here are some words that might help you come up with ideas. Promising, haunting, mysterious, suspenseful, powerful, unpredictable, refreshing. You can choose one of these words or come up with an even better word of your own choosing. If you're having trouble, try using Google to look up synonyms and antonyms of words that pop into your mind. Let's go back now and take another look at that brief poem by Emily Dickinson. Poetry is meant to be read aloud because the sounds that the words make help us to understand the meaning of the poem. Pause this video for a moment and read this poem aloud right now. What do you think that means? Do any words catch your attention? What about the words dead and live? Those are interesting ideas when applied to a word. Let's think about that. Imagine that all of the words in your head are like leaves on a tree. You know, thousands of words, and one tree holds many leaves. If a leaf falls off the tree, like a word spoken leaves your body, what happens to the leaf? What happens to the words we say? Can we take a dead leaf and attach it back to the tree to make it come alive again? No. Can we unsay the words we've already said aloud? No. Once we put our words out there, they're out there for better or worse. So then the next question becomes, what happens next? Is it over, just like the first half of the poem suggests? A word is dead when it is said, some say. Or can we put words out there in a way that they create good things, lasting consequences that provoke thought and more words? Like the leaves that fall from the tree and help to prepare the ground for new growth, like the second half of the poem. I say it just begins to live that day. Remember that we said a poet must always be aware of the consequences of their diction. Poems are short, so every word is chosen with a purpose in mind. This poem has only 19 words in it, but there's one word that's mentioned twice. Do you see it? It's right here. Say. There are so many words to choose from. Why say twice in the same short poem? Well, for one thing, it highlights the fact that we're saying words to talk about the words we say. That's meta. And there's also another deeper message here. What does it say about the some people who believe that words have no consequences? What kinds of words do you think those people use? On the other hand, Emily Dickinson writes, I say, before she describes words that offer future promises. What does that tell you about the kinds of poet she might be? She died in 1886, and we're still reading her poetry more than 130 years later. So maybe her words are still living. Because every word in a poem has consequences. The best poems include imagery, sensory descriptions, to paint the most vivid picture in fewer words than you would find in a prose paragraph. A poet's diction has the greatest effect on the reader if it paints a picture in the reader's mind. Why? Because our five senses affect our emotions, and the connotations associated with emotions are strong. Let's stop here for just a second for a mini lesson within our lesson. The word effect that starts with an E is a noun. It is the outcome that follows a cause and effect. A person uses imagery, and the effect is that it paints a picture in the reader's mind. The word affect starts with an A, and it's a verb. It means to impact or to cause change. When our five senses are engaged, they impact our emotions. Now, back to our regularly scheduled programming. What five senses are we talking about? The same ones you've learned about in science class. But what do these five senses have to do with imagery? One way to get a handle on what imagery is to notice what imagery is not. This is not imagery. There were mountains outside the tent. Is it possible to see mountains? Yes. And sight is one of the five senses, so this is imagery, right? No. Imagery happens when you use sensory descriptions to create a specific sensation in the reader's mind. When you read, there were mountains outside the tent, what do you see in your mind? This kind of mountain, this kind of mountain, this one, or maybe you were thinking about something else entirely. The sentence, there were mountains outside the tent, might hint at the sense of sight, but it's not nearly descriptive enough to paint a picture in the mind of the reader. So try this instead. The tent's mouth gaped in awe. Soft peaks reached toward the sky as far as the clouds. Congregations of towering trees swayed and worshipped in the sweet mossy breeze. Now, which mountains do you see? This one, definitely. I wrote this little poem while looking at this picture. There's a lot going on in this poem. There's a metaphor comparing the opening of the tents to someone's mouth gaping, hanging open because they're looking at something awesome. The mountains are reaching upwards to heaven. It must be heaven because the trees are standing in congregations like little groups of people in churches, and they sway and they worship just like people do in church sometimes. It must be a serene and blissful scene because the mountains are soft and the breeze is sweet and smells like moss, a pretty benign and harmless plant. I've tried to give you as many things to think about as possible within 6 short lines of poetry. So back to our initial question. What's so interesting about poetry? What is it that makes poetry special and maybe even more powerful than prose? Well, diction, for one thing. You can assume that every word in a poem is chosen with great care. Denotation and connotation. Poets use literal descriptions to send implied messages to the reader. The reader then infers meaning based on personal experiences. That's why poems can be interpreted in different ways. Different readers have different experiences. Remember, poetry is literature, and literature is art. Finally, imagery plays a huge part in what makes a poem so interesting. Just think about it. You have the power to write down words that you choose in a specific way that affects other people. You can create change with your words.